If you want to understand how families lose the house in old age, stop imagining one dramatic disaster. That is not usually how it happens. Most people think the threat is the nursing home bill itself. They imagine one giant invoice arriving out of nowhere, everyone panicking, and the house being sold because life turned cruel all at once. Sometimes it feels that way in the moment, but the deeper truth is harsher. The trap was often built years earlier, when the family still had time, still had options, and still thought the house was safe, simply because no one had told them otherwise. That is the real story. The house is not usually taken because the family was reckless. It is taken because the family learned the rules too late. That is the mother line. The most expensive sentence in elder care is not, "The nursing home costs too much." The most expensive sentence is, "We didn't know that counted." That one sentence destroys inheritances, forces sales, wipes out savings, and turns a lifetime of careful ownership into a liquidation event for the state and the facility. The uploaded source document is emotionally intense, but underneath that intensity sits a very real structural warning. The so-called Medicaid 5-year look-back rule is not just some technical administrative check. It is a system that punishes families for transfers they often made in total innocence. A check to a grandchild money for a wedding, help with tuition, a car transferred to a relative, a loan quietly forgiven because family is family in ordinary life. These feel like normal acts of love. In the Medicaid system, they can become disqualifying transfers. That is a brutal difference in meaning. And once you understand that, you stop thinking about elder care planning as a late life legal detail. You start seeing it for what it really is. Asset defense architecture. This is the first mechanism I want you to understand. I call it the innocent transfer trap. The public hears look back and imagines the state is searching for fraud, hidden millions, last-minute asset dumps. Rich people gaming the system. That is the comforting version because it makes the rule sound targeted and fair. The reality is more disturbing. The rule catches normal families doing normal family things without understanding that Medicaid uses a completely different moral language from the one they use at the kitchen table. The IRS may allow gifts, family may expect gifts, your heart may want to give. Medicaid does not care. That is the point. It does not care whether the transfer was loving, modest, or culturally normal. It cares whether value left your name during the 60-month look-back period before the state had to decide whether to pay for long-term care. If value left, the state can impose a penalty period, and that penalty is not a little slap on the wrist. It is a period of ineligibility during which the nursing home still expects to be paid. That is where the nightmare begins. Because the whole reason most people apply for Medicaid in the first place is that they cannot afford the care themselves. This is the second mechanism. I call it the no-payer gap. A lot of people think a Medicaid penalty means a fine. It is worse than a fine. A fine is a known amount. A Medicaid penalty often creates a stretch of time where neither the family nor the state is positioned to pay the bill. You transferred the money, so the state says you disqualified yourself, but because you transferred the money, you also do not have the money sitting there anymore to cover the cost privately. So the nursing home remains unpaid and starts looking for whatever asset is still reachable. That is when the house turns from shelter into target. The source document explains this part correctly. The house may often be exempt for eligibility purposes while you are alive and living in it, but exempt does not mean untouchable forever. That is one of the most dangerous misunderstandings in all of elder planning families. Here, the house is exempt, and mentally translate that into the house is safe. Those are not the same sentence. Exempt during qualification is not the same as protected from recovery. That difference destroys people. Because once the Medicaid recipient dies, the estate recovery process can activate. Now, the home is no longer simply where someone lived. It is an estate asset from which the state may attempt to recover costs. If heirs cannot satisfy the claim another way, the property becomes the obvious source of payment. That is the third mechanism. I call it the delayed attack illusion. The house is not always attacked at the front door. Sometimes it is spared at the beginning only to be captured at the end. This is why so many families get blindsided. They hear one partial truth and build a false conclusion around it. The house doesn't T-count. The house is exempt. Medicaid can T-take the house while mom is alive. Fine, those statements can contain pieces of truth. But the real question was never only whether the house counts on day one. The real question is whether the house survives the whole process. Eligibility, care, death, estate recovery, liens, claims, and possible litigation from the facility itself. That is a much harder question, and once you ask it honestly, a lot of comforting myths disappear. Now let us talk about the healthy spouse, because this is where many married couples get lulled into a second false sense of safety. They hear that protections exist for the spouse who remains at home and they relax. Again, partial truth, dangerous conclusion. Yes, there is protection. Yes, the law does not always force absolute destitution on the spouse remaining in the house. But the public hears protected and imagines comfortable. That is not the same thing. What matters is not whether some protected amount exists. What matters is whether that amount can sustain a real life for the healthy spouse over however many years remain. That is a very different standard. The source document highlights the community spouse resource allowance and makes the critical point that a legal allowance can still be economically thin once it has to cover taxes, insurance, maintenance, food, medications, emergencies, and the ordinary unpredictability of life for years or even decades. That is exactly right. This is the fourth mechanism. I call it the legal protection mirage. Governments often protect people on paper more generously than they protect them in lived reality. A figure may sound large in abstract conversation and turn out to be deeply inadequate once it must fund the actual life left standing after one spouse enters care. This matters because many families stop planning the moment they hear some official protection exists. They mistake statutory language for actual safety. That is lazy planning. And lazy planning is exactly what the Medicaid system punishes. Now here's where I want to be very clear. The core problem is not Medicaid itself. The core problem is sequence. Families use the wrong sequence. They wait until a crisis, then start asking legal questions. But elder asset protection is not designed to work best in crisis. It is designed to work before crisis. The source document is absolutely right about this. By the time a hospital discharge planner, a facility administrator, or a frightened adult child starts asking what can be done now, the set of clean moves is already much smaller than it used to be. That is why I keep coming back to one word. Timing. The fifth mechanism is what I call the early architecture rule. In most families, the biggest asset protection advantage is not sophistication. It is starting while time still exists, not because the law is beautiful, because the law is mechanical. Certain structures only work if they are funded early enough and left alone long enough. That is why a properly structured Medicaid asset protection trust can be so powerful. It changes ownership before the look back can reach it. It moves the asset out of the future recovery path if enough time passes. It lets the family stop relying on hope and start relying on architecture. Hope is a terrible elder care strategy. Architecture is better. Now, I do not want to turn this into magical thinking. A Medicaid asset protection trust is not a toy. It is not a downloadable form. It is not something a generalist lawyer should casually wave at people between wills and simple estate documents. It is serious. It is irrevocable. It requires real understanding. It changes control. It changes access. It changes what belongs to whom and under what terms. That is why the right lawyer matters so much. And that brings me to another ugly truth in the source document. Most people walk into the wrong office. They ask for the wrong thing. They buy the wrong kind of legal work. And they leave feeling prepared when, in fact, they were only made document rich in protection, poor. That is an expensive mistake. A will is not a Medicaid plan. A basic revocable living trust is not a Medicaid protection trust. A general estate conversation is not the same as elder. Law planning built around long-term care exposure, that difference matters a great deal. This is the sixth mechanism. I call it the document decoy. Families love paperwork because paperwork feels like progress. Someone signed something, a binder exists. The lawyer billed hours, therefore preparation happened. Not necessarily in elder care law. The name of the document matters. The timing of the funding matters. The specific state rules matter. The lawyer S-Corps specialty matters. And if those things are wrong, the family may hold a stack of perfectly real legal papers that do almost nothing against the specific danger they were actually afraid of. That is why I respect specialists. Not because specialists sound fancy, because the system itself is specialized. The source document mentions certified elder law attorneys, and the principle is correct even if families never remember the credential letters. You do not want someone who also does elder work sometimes. You want someone who lives in the world of Medicaid timing, trust funding, spousal protections, recovery rules, look back exposure, and state-specific mechanics every week. That is how you reduce expensive surprises. Now we need to talk about the half-a-loaf kind of last-minute rescue strategies, because this is where families often get seduced by false hope. Yes, there are late-stage strategies that can sometimes preserve part of the estate when there is no time left for a full 5-year runway. Fine, they can matter, they can save something, But the public hears that and starts telling itself a comforting story. We can wait if things get bad, the lawyer can still do something. That is a dangerous mindset. Because emergency strategy is not the same as plan protection. This is the seventh mechanism. I call it the salvage mistake. Salvage is what you do after damage begins. Planning is what you do before. The difference between saving part of the loaf and protecting the bakery is enormous. Families who plan early often preserve the house, preserve more savings, preserve more control, and preserve far more dignity than families who wait until the nursing home conversation is already happening in real time. That is why I say the most expensive day in this process is often not the day care begins. It is the day after you should have started planning. Now let us zoom out. The real lesson here is not only about Medicaid, it is about how ordinary families misunderstand ownership. They think an asset is protected because they own it. In reality, ownership without planning is often just visibility. The house sits there fully exposed, titled, accessible, recoverable, and emotionally impossible for the family to imagine losing. The government knows it exists. The nursing home knows it exists. The court can know it exists. Your emotional attachment does not change any of that. That is why I always say this. Unplanned ownership is not security. It is exposure. And later in life, exposure gets expensive fast. So here's where I come down. The 5-year rule is not mainly dangerous because it is obscure. It is dangerous because it punishes kindness, normal family transfers, and delayed planning inside a system most people do not understand until one spouse is already fragile and options have narrowed. The house is not automatically safe. The spouse at home is not automatically comfortable. The children are not automatically protected, and a basic estate plan is not automatically an elder care defense system. If a family wants the home to survive, if it wants savings to survive, if it wants inheritance to mean something more than a story told too late, then the time to act is before care is needed, before transfers become penalties, before the look back is already running against you. That is the whole thing, not fear sequence. Because in the end, families do not usually lose the house because they never loved each other enough or never worked hard enough. They lose it because the rule book began acting on their assets long before they realized they were finally playing the game. And the only real way to win that kind of game is to start before the state starts counting.